This is why children go to middle school. They go to middle school to learn how to interact with all kinds of peers who they haven't necessarily grown up with, and all kinds of teachers who they may not mesh with well. And those are the skills they're going to need for life.
Schools everywhere are welcoming a new crop of excited, nervous, and sometimes unprepared kids. Maybe the biggest and most difficult transition is the move to middle school. Today, we're revisiting a conversation with Phyllis Fagell. She's the author of the book Middle School Matters. And we talk about changes parents can expect to see as their kids adapt to new surroundings, and we'll have ideas and advice for how to minimize the stress of that transition. Mentoring tweens through transitions, straight ahead on episode 136. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
Some news for educators and anyone else who wants to better understand the challenges of educating twice exceptional students, kids who are cognitively gifted and also have another disability. We're opening up our course, Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students, to everyone. So far, we've focused on getting it into school districts and organizations, but soon it will be available to everyone else. Even better, anyone who pre-registers now will get a 20% discount. And if you're an educator and take the course for continuing ed credits, and then your district licenses it for the whole staff, we'll refund your tuition payment. There's a link to pre-register in the show notes, or you can go to neurodiversity.university to get signed up. My conversation with Phyllis Fagell is next.
on a previous episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
I think there is this kind of in our cultural DNA still, this idea that properly behaving, children should be seen and not heard. I think there's kind of this mystical, unspoken idea that behavior management is appropriate and somehow valued. Somehow, with how the research was interpreted as successful, it became the mainstay of our education system. And when you look at the science, the neuroscience of resilience, and you lay that side by side to behavioral management, the two don't line up very well.
That's episode 116. Find it in your favorite podcast app.
You're listening to
The Neurodiversity Podcast.
Our guest today is Phyllis Fagell. She works with educators and parents to help prepare kids for the difficult transitions ahead. In fact, she wrote a book called Middle School Matters, and it is an excellent resource. Phyllis, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
So middle school has really always been one of my favorite age groups. I'm sure you know this, the look that people give you when you tell them that you work with middle school kids and that you enjoy it, and they look at you a little bit like you're kind of crazy.
I know that look.
But there's something about this age group that I feel like is just really, really special and kind of cool. What for you would you say it is that makes middle school kids and those middle school years really a unique time?
I personally love middle schoolers. I think it's a magical time in kids' development. They're young enough to be unjaded and still really open to the opinions of those around them, but they're also old enough to grasp sophisticated concepts. And it's an age where it's incredibly safe to make mistakes and incredibly rewarding to help kids develop a set of core values and figure out who they are as a human being and as a learner and as a friend. It's just an incredibly exciting time in childhood development.
Yeah, there's still some innocence, but 5 minutes later, they're like these mini adults. It's really an interesting time.
It really is. I had a principal once tell me that the reason he loves the age so much is because the same kid can either present as 13 going on 3 or 13 going on 30, depending on when you catch them.
I know a lot of parents, I think part of that look that people give you like you're crazy is I think people reflect back on their own experiences when they were in middle school. When you're talking to the parents of middle school kids, what are some of the most common things that that they're bringing up to you that are their concerns?
Well, first, I think you're absolutely right about parents bringing their own middle school issues to the table. And I like to remind them that the reason those memories are so intense and so painful is because they experienced them in real time during a phase where they felt that the world was watching them and they felt intensely self-critical anyway. So some of those negative memories are actually inflated in our own minds. And in my experience working with middle schoolers, it doesn't have to be this terrible experience. But the things that I think parents worry about the most generally are reflective of whatever was either the biggest stumbling block for them. And that might have been, social growing pains, or it could have been academic challenges. For some parents, it's that letting go that's difficult. In elementary school, they're so involved in their child's social life and volunteering in the school, perhaps, and then suddenly they're kind of tossed to the side, and it's time for them to let their kid develop some autonomy, and that can be difficult. And then in other situations, parents have some very real concerns based on things that their child already is struggling with that they have a sense will only be heightened when they enter middle school, and they're untethered from that homeroom structure and exposed to, revolving sets of teachers and peers. And that can be a hard transition for some kids, especially if they already have some challenges, either socially or academically.
I think you're right, that difficulty that parents run into losing touch when kids go to the middle school, it makes them feel unstable because when they're in the elementary school, it's like you have one teacher that you can go to. And when the kids get to middle school and they have multiple teachers throughout the day, it's really difficult to keep up with what's going on in each class. And if you're concerned about your kids' grades, or, a lot of times they have this influx of students from other schools. And so you don't know all of those peers or what those influences are. I can see that being a really difficult thing for parents. How do you help them through that?
So some of it is self-talk, remembering that middle school is a very safe time to take risks and to experiment and to veer off course. And in the same way we would say to our child who is worried about an outcome, well, what's the worst that can happen? And what would you do in that situation? And we would walk them through that. I think sometimes parents need to do that for themselves and to say, this is why children go to middle school. They go to middle school to learn how to interact with all kinds of peers who they haven't necessarily grown up with, and all kinds of teachers who they may not mesh with well. And those are the skills they're going to need for life. And the more we hold their hands and the less we let them have those growing pains and make those mistakes, the less resilient they'll be as they move beyond middle school to high school and become adults.
You talk a lot in the book about the importance of authenticity. I feel like that's just a really important tool that we can use as parents and educators as far as making connections with our kids. What about authenticity do you think is so important when it comes to making those connections with this age group?
So if you think about middle schoolers as being intensely insecure, all of them are insecure and very self-critical and very concerned about everyone looking at them and what they're thinking. It's a time when it's particularly difficult to admit weakness or to admit that you have fears or concerns or worries. And as parents to our children, we look like we have it all together, that our life was a straight line from point A to point B. And somehow magically we went from, middle school to success, or middle school to, just seeming like we know what we're doing. And I think it's really important to be authentic and to tell our kids where we ran into trouble along the way, to admit our mistakes, to admit our weaknesses, and to let them know that we will be right there by their side as they make those mistakes. We can't prevent the mistakes as much as we would like to wrap them in, bubble wrap and make their life perfect. We can't do that for them, but we can be there for them and we can let them know that it will be okay. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is to be authentic about the things you struggle with yourself. And that also makes it safe for kids to come to you when they're having a problem. If they think you're going to overreact, if they think that you're going to judge them, they're very unlikely to let you know when they could use your support.
Something my mom always used to say was, well, can't you just learn from my mistakes? And it was kind of like, well, no, I'm definitely going to make all of my own mistakes. I'm going to make some that you made and some of my own, and I'm going to, do them.
Yes. No, I get that. I was definitely a kid who had to learn through experience.
Yeah. You talk about being able to be vulnerable in front of kids because that allows them to like you said, know that it's safe to come to you when they have a problem. If they feel like the expectation is that they're always perfect or that they can't make mistakes or they should already know how to handle certain situations, that's when I feel like they get in trouble because they do try to then solve the problem or handle it on their own when really they need some support from those adults that are around them.
So true. Or they shut down completely.
Yeah.
It's just not even worth trying. I spoke to a writer, Katie Hurley, who told me that she would tell her kids all the time, I submitted my book 20 times to publishers and it never got picked up. My next book did, but not that one. And, the message implicit in that is I kept trying. I didn't let it defeat me. But this is not something that happened overnight. It takes hard work and persistence and diligence. And that's how life goes. And that's just part of the process of growing up. And kids don't necessarily know that because they have no life experience. They have no perspective.
Many of the members of our audience, are either parents or educators of gifted and 2E kids. And a lot of times they have this perception of the world around them that is much bigger than they are. They see what other people do and they feel like they should also be able to do those things. But the concern a lot of times with bright kids is kind of that existential awareness and depression at a really young age. And the thing I always go back to is, well, they don't have the life experience to fall back on to find their own resources to handle that uncertainty or whatever that feeling might be that they're having.
That's true. I see that with gifted kids a lot, that sensitivity. They're taking everything in at such an incredibly fast pace, and they're not always able to contextualize it, especially in the case of kids who are twice exceptional, who are gifted, but who might struggle in one particular area. Those kids are just as likely to be perfectionistic as kids who are just plain gifted, but then they have maybe a challenge that's getting in their way. And that can be especially distressing because they're so hyper aware of exactly how they're falling short in their own mind.
Another thing about that middle school experience is, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, is like they're really kind of trying to figure out who they are because they're no longer these little kids. And so they kind of end up trying on these different personalities to see what fits, like you were talking about with the principal, and sometimes it can be a little confusing for us. We're like, are there multiple personalities? What's happening here? It switches so fast. But what are some of the things that you notice that help kids find who they are? What is their identity? And how can we really help them to embrace that?
I think parents can get fixated on a definitive identity for their child, So what I tell parents, number one, is to try on the idea of their child coming to them with, news that, let's say, they're gay or, they're not sure about their gender identity. Imagine in advance how you would respond so that you can really be supportive and react the way you'd like to in the moment. Because I think for parents, especially if they're looking at their 11-year-old sixth grader, they, in their own mind, have trouble accepting that this child does have a sense of who they are, or who they're becoming. And maybe they will be gay, maybe they won't. But what I tell parents is, and this goes for any kind of identity, the kid who was very interested in dresses who's suddenly very goth, or, the kid who was really into sports and suddenly, has no interest in doing competitive soccer anymore. All of those shifts can be kind of shocking for parents and hard to wrap their minds around. But what I tell parents is, as long as you accept them wherever they are, it may be a stopping place for them. It may be ultimately who they are or how they present in the long run. But just be supportive along the way at whatever they're presenting you with at that moment in time, and they'll keep coming to you and they'll keep sharing whatever it is that they're going through. And that's really what you want, is to be a sounding board and somebody that they will come to for advice and guidance as they're figuring out what their identity is. The identity itself is going to continue to shift and change, throughout their lives, but especially in middle school. The kid who maybe wants to be in a different crowd and might, try on a new identity just to fit in with certain kids, or the kid who is really interested in, in theater in elementary school might decide in middle school that this is a time when they really want to branch out and do something different. And as parents, our job is to really facilitate that and encourage their interests and let them run with it.
I mean, I think if we reflect back on our own experiences, I think we can relate to that.
That's a key piece of this as well. We might have some certain core parts of our personality that have remained consistent, but we've changed and adjusted based on the people we've interacted with, based on the education we've had, based on where we've lived or what we've read. And the same is true for our kids. They're going to continue to shift and change as they take in information and as they meet new people.
This is the other thing I know about, I think, this age group. Elementary school kids are sometimes blissfully unaware that there's a world around them and that other people are aware of anything that they're doing. But then as they get into middle school, all of a sudden they feel like everybody is watching every move that they make. And they're very concerned with how others are perceiving them. What are some other ways that we can help those kids when they are just really either anxious and terrified that people are going to judge them, or even kind of like obsessive about putting on a certain outward appearance, when they feel like they're under the microscope?
I have several ways of answering that question. The first is to be a non-judgmental presence in general. So don't be self-critical. Don't be judgy about other people that you're meeting. Really teach your child that it's important to embrace differences and to be inclusive and to be accepting of people who are not like you. Because the more you do that, the more likely they are to accept themselves, in addition to accepting other people. The second thing is to validate their fears and to ask questions and come from a stance of curiosity. I can see it's really important to you to, make a good impression on these kids. I'm really curious. I'd love to know why this is so important right now, and just try to get a sense of what's going on in their mind and in their world, and to not dismiss those fears, to really validate them. The temptation, if a child says, everyone's going to think I'm a loser, is to say, how could anyone think you're a loser? You're such a cool kid, or just to say something that feels reassuring. But that actually doesn't do anything to make a middle schooler feel better. You're far better off saying, if I were worried that everyone was going to criticize what I wore, I'd be pretty anxious about picking out my outfit too. And just letting them know you hear them and that you understand where they're coming from. And validating doesn't mean you agree. It just means that you can empathize, you can understand.
One of the things that stood out to me that you were just talking about was about not being self-critical for parents, and tying that back to what you mentioned earlier about being able to be authentic and vulnerable. What would you say is the difference there between adults who have a lot of those sometimes same tendencies to be very harsh with themselves if they have any perfectionism or anything like that?
Yeah.
But then being able to be authentic and vulnerable too. Where's that line?
So when working with kids who struggle with anxiety, you really want to challenge any thoughts that are really out of whack or out of balance, and kind of pull them back to the middle. So if they're catastrophizing, or if they're thinking in terms of all or nothing and black and white, you really want to help them assess a situation more realistically. And I think that as parents, we need to be modeling that behavior. So if we're being critical just to be critical, or because our own thoughts are out of whack, or we're, we don't have a really realistic sense of ourselves, or we're setting unattainable expectations for ourselves, then we're not modeling that healthy self-acceptance and self-awareness for kids. But if, on the other hand, without judgment, you're saying, you know what, I messed up my presentation at work today, but that's okay. Tomorrow I have another one. And what I learned from this last one is that I need to have some notes up there with me. So I'm going to try it different this time. So in that second example, you're explaining that you've made a mistake, but you're also talking about how you regrouped, and you're not castigating yourself, or, deciding that you're a horrible, awful person and you're going to get fired and the world is going to end. You're just explaining that sometimes things go wrong. So it's a fine line to walk, but what you're really trying to do is to be authentic and to model that things don't always go perfectly, but you're also modeling some self-forgiveness and some self-compassion and the ability to pick up the pieces and move forward.
Gifted and twice exceptional kids, they deal with perfectionism, they worry about getting good grades, and, their parents are definitely, and teachers are part of that equation. So how do you help kids and their parents who are worried about things like GPA and getting into good colleges and those sorts of things?
It is, in a way, a form of faulty thinking. College is a stop on the journey. It's not the destination. And what I really encourage parents to do is to think bigger, to think about what you want your child's life to look like and the skills that you want them to have, so that they can manage in an economy that's changing so rapidly. So to me, I'm far more focused on skill development. Can they pivot? Are they flexible? Can they get along with other people? And if you are focused solely on grades, you're putting equal effort into everything probably, or excessive effort in one area just to get that one up to an A to match the other A's. And you're completely losing sight of what your kids' real interests and strengths are. And once they're out and in the world, what they're going to do is spend, most of their time doing something that plays to their strengths and that they enjoy. And what I fear is that we lose that self-discovery process when we're focused on the grades themselves. That said, it's also a way of managing uncertainty and anxiety. It goes back to that perfectionism, it gives people this false sense of control that maybe if my kid gets all A's and gets perfect scores on their ACT or their SAT and they go to XYZ college, that their life will be set and they'll be successful and I don't have to worry about them. But that's not how it works anyway.
Right. So focusing on all of those little things is kind of like, what is the phrase? Losing sight of the forest for the trees.
Exactly. And now if you look at some of the major companies, Google, I can think of several consulting companies. Some of them are not even requiring a college degree. And in fact, I spoke to a professor at Williams who teaches design thinking. And he was saying that the kids who show up at Williams, a lot of them who have straight A's and were valedictorian of their class have a really hard time with the adjustment to college because they do not know how to fail. They do not know how to take risks. They can't think outside the box. So he spends all this time with them trying to undo that stilted thinking that they've fallen into because they've been so afraid of failure. So we end up creating a new problem in the process of trying to control an outcome differently.
What do you do with kids when they come to you and they're very concerned about this, like their grades, like they're really just kind of panicked about, about whether or not they're going to be able to take the pre-AP class or, whatever the courses might be? Like, how do you talk them through that?
I think much as a child is worrying about the outfit they're going to wear, I think the first thing you do is you validate that fear. Tell me more about why this is important to you. What do you think will happen? Well, let's play that out all the way. Okay, you didn't get into that advanced math class that you wanted to go to, and you're going to be in on-level math. Now what? And then have them walk through all the way to the end and then ask them, how can you handle that situation? Or what is the worst possible outcome? And 9 times out of 10, it's not nearly as bad as they've somehow jumped to in their mind as the conclusion that it's this catastrophe. Another thing you can do is ask them, how would you advise a friend? Sometimes depersonalizing it a little bit and asking them to advise somebody else helps them see it a little more clearly. And you can even do visual imagery. I've taken kids up in an imaginary hot air balloon ride and, up in the sky looking down on the problem from this vantage point. Does it look different? What happened right before? What might happen afterwards? How could you alter the outcome? And if it's really important to them to get into a class and it's something that they want to do and it's a feasible option, then I'll help them try to figure out how to make that happen, or figure out what supports they need in order to give it a try. I do believe that if a kid wants to challenge themselves, most of the time we should give them that opportunity.
Yeah, it's hard to figure out sometimes what's beneath that. Is it because their friends are going to be in that class and so then they feel left out, that their friends are going to be in this upper level class? Or is it that fear that they're not going to be good enough or smart enough or whatever that might be? There's definitely, I think, an exploration process with how you determine where that decision-making process is coming from for them.
Yes, and I think it's helpful to remind kids that even if someone else's life looks perfect and they're taking all the classes that you wish you were taking, everybody is giving something up in order to do whatever it is that they're doing. So that kid who's getting straight A's probably has less time to sleep or less time to hang out with friends. Or the child who is taking all advanced classes may have less time to spend on their art hobby or something else. And so everything is always a trade-off. And to kids, it can look like somebody else has it all together or has this perfect existence and they're somehow missing out or they're somehow falling short. And just reminding them and just hearing from the adults in their life that you don't have to have it all together. It's okay to be a little lopsided. It's okay to develop different skills at different times. That's more realistic and more true to life. And whoever it is that you're looking at who you think has it all together does not have it all together. It's just on the surface. It's like Facebook or Instagram. That's just the image they're projecting out.
Another quote from my mom, the only normal people are the ones you don't know very well.
I love that. And I also prefer to hang out with people who are not normal.
So tell me a little bit, you mentioned social media and like people, the kids kind of seeing the highlight reel of their peers. How do you feel like that influences that development through those middle school age years?
Well, there are so many ways that social media is impacting kids today, aside from just the distraction piece of it. And, there's research showing that simply having a phone on hand can lower your grades, even if it's off. But what I see is that it can interfere with sleep. If a child is texting with friends in a group chat, they might feel rude, dropping out. And one thing leads to another, and nothing good tends to happen late at night online in group chats. So kids tend to need a lot of support in managing the time they spend on social media. The other thing that social media does is it can really mess with kids' self-image. Historically, we've worried more about girls, but even boys, the more time they spend online looking at social media, the worse they feel about their bodies. And sometimes we just need to encourage kids to take a break, especially if they're suffering from low self-confidence. I think that social media generally doesn't help in any way, shape, or form. It tends to exacerbate that FOMO, that fear of missing out. It tends to artificially, inflate how other people's lives look in relation to their own. They can feel slighted when no slight was intended because you're missing out on all of those face-to-face social cues that you get when kids are interacting face-to-face, and they're not having as much of a chance to practice those social skills that are so important to their long-term development as well.
I talk to kids all the time at the office who are just devastated sometimes by something that's happened online or through texting and not knowing how to respond or what to say. Or the other thing is sometimes, especially talking about those twice exceptional kids, sometimes I find that I have clients who really are being pretty overtly bullied or kids are being mean to them over social media and they don't pick up on it, and their parents see it or their parents might be concerned about it. But because they already struggle maybe with reading some of those social situations, they miss it there too, which kind of makes them even more vulnerable.
And for those kids in particular, and I'm thinking of some students I've had in the past who have had ADHD or who have really struggled with impulsivity and who are more likely to get themselves into hot water on social media or to miss those cues. It's particularly important that parents are still involved in middle school, spot checking their texts, making sure that they put the phone away late at night and that there are limits. And in some cases, not giving them access to social media because they're only going to blow up their own social life or create so much havoc for themselves that it's just not worth the trade-off of momentarily maybe feeling like they fit in.
What do you want parents and educators to know? Like, what's the one thing that you really want them to take away?
For kids who are already feeling so vulnerable, who are already in such flux and in such transition and prone to deep insecurity, the best thing parents can do for kids this age is simply to honor them and accept them for who they are. There's a pediatrician at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia who likes to say that the wider the gap between who a child is and who they think you want them to be or need them to be, the more they're going to struggle. And I think that's so true. So the best thing that parents of kids this age can do is just love your child. Just be there as a coach. Don't try to control every outcome. And accept that this is a difficult phase. And what they really need is simply your consistent presence, your unwavering love, and to understand that you're there for them, no matter what mistakes they make or no matter how they either fall short or perceive that they fall short.
Phyllis, thank you so much for your time talking to us today.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
As an adult lucky enough to have a job working with kids, I really love that awkward stage of elbows and acne, even though I know that it's agony for these tweens. They are dealing with intense vulnerability like they've never experienced before. There's a new awareness of themselves and the world around them. They're trying on all of these different personas, deciding what fits for them, what characteristics they'll keep, and what they're going to return. Our job is to be their mirror, reflecting to them the values and the beliefs that'll help them grow into their role in the world, whatever that role may be. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
We've been down this road before. We check for monsters by the door, and it makes you feel stuck inside a wheel. It slowly holds you in where you've never been. And I really feel stuck in the middle here. You can break my bones with your sticks and stones, but it's all too clear that the end is near. 'Cause I really feel stuck in the middle here. I can take no more. I will leave this shore to get back on track, and I won't come back, no, no.
Our thanks to Phyllis Fagell. There's a link to her book, Middle School Matters, in the show notes. One more thing, wherever it is you listen, please click the subscribe button. It's how Apple and other platforms rank podcast popularity. And also, we'd love if you'd write a review. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our social media and production assistant is Krista Brown. The executive producer and studio editor is me, Dave Morris. For everyone here, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Stuck in the middle here. I can take no more. I will leave this shore to get back on track, and I won't come back, no, no.
This is a production of the Neurodiversity Alliance.